Meet Ferdinand Marcos, charmer, lawyer, war hero, and I use that word the same way I use organic on a bag of gas station gummy bears. Marcos was the kind of man who could smile at you while calculating exactly how much blood he'd need to wring from your country to keep his shoes polished. And then there was Imelda, former beauty queen, patron saint of vanity, a woman who believed that if she looked fabulous enough, no one would notice the smell of corruption wafting behind her. Together they weren't just a couple, they were a dynasty in the making. A dynasty drenched in cash, cloaked in power, and lubricated with lies. Ferdinand started out playing the role of brilliant lawyer, cutting his teeth in cases that made him look like a prodigy. He loved telling people about his silver tongue, his courtroom genius. But genius was never enough for him. He needed myth, he needed legend. And so, he built one, a heroic tale of war medals, guerrilla resistance, and fighting the Japanese like some Southeast Asian Rambo. Problem was, most of it was complete fiction. His war record had more holes in it than Swiss cheese left in a rat colony. But no matter. In politics, lies age like fine wine if you tell them with enough confidence. And Marcos told his stories with a swagger that made even his skeptics hesitate. And Imelda, she was the perfect accessory, tall, glamorous, dripping with charisma. She knew how to turn a room into her stage, how to take a spotlight and stretch it into an empire. When Ferdinand ran for office, she wasn't just standing by his side, she was the campaign itself. A smiling sequined ad for his ambition, and people ate it up. The Philippines, battered by poverty and eager for strong leadership, bought the package. Ferdinand the warrior statesman and Imelda the radiant first lady. Together they radiated modernity, hope, and promise. At least on the surface. Marcos climbed through the ranks with the precision of a man who knew exactly what power tasted like. He became president in 1965, presenting himself as the man who would modernize the Philippines. Infrastructure, roads, dams, development, oh, he promised it all. And to be fair, he did build. Bridges, highways, buildings. But he also built something else. A political machine designed to funnel loyalty, money, and control directly into his pocket. From the beginning, it wasn't about serving the nation. It was about constructing a system where the Philippines served him. Re-election in 1969 sealed his taste for absolute power. He spent like a drunken sailor on campaign steroids, drowning the country in debt to buy votes and loyalty. But debts come due, and so do political realities. The economy began to stagger, protests erupted, and suddenly Marcos's dream of being president for life looked shaky. Enter martial law. Or as Marcos sold it, the only way to save the Philippines from chaos, communism, and collapse. In reality, it was the only way to save Ferdinand Marcos from losing his throne. On September 21, 1972, at least that's the date Marcos later insisted on, though he actually signed the proclamation 2 days earlier, martial law descended like a guillotine. Civil liberties, gone. Press freedom, dead. Opposition, silenced. Congress, disbanded. He called it constitutional authoritarianism, which is about as honest as calling a pickpocket a wallet relocation specialist. What it really was, dictatorship, neatly gift-wrapped in legal jargon. Martial law turned the Philippines into Marcos's playground. Political enemies were arrested, tortured, or simply vanished. Students, journalists, activists, anyone who raised a hand against the regime found themselves inside interrogation chambers where beatings, electrocutions, waterboarding, and sexual violence were routine. The military became his enforcers, the police his guard dogs, and fear his most reliable currency. He promised order. What he delivered was a nightmare, stitched together by curfews, propaganda, and the ever-present possibility of a knock at the door. And while the country bled, the Marcoses feasted, literally. Ferdinand used the state like his personal ATM. Billions were siphoned from the treasury, hidden in Swiss bank accounts, laundered through shell companies, and used to buy property all over the world. Imelda? She went shopping, not shopping like you or I, shopping like a monarch on cocaine. Jewelry, art, real estate in Manhattan, Hawaiian mansions, Michelangelo paintings, and of course, the infamous shoes. Thousands of pairs neatly lined up, as if footwear were some kind of antidote to the stench of tyranny. To Imelda, excess wasn't vulgar, it was destiny. She once said, "The Philippines is my inheritance." And she meant it. The Marcos kleptocracy wasn't subtle, it was flamboyant, almost performative in its corruption. Loans from the IMF and World Bank were funneled into projects that served more as monuments to their vanity than as engines of national growth. Nuclear plants that never worked, cultural centers that doubled as Imelda's stage, infrastructure built not for utility, but for legacy. By the early 1980s, the Philippines was drowning in debt, industries were hollowed out, and ordinary Filipinos were scraping to survive while their leaders waded through diamonds and designer gowns. But tyrannies, no matter how gaudy, carry an expiration date. Opposition never fully disappeared. Dissidents whispered in the dark, activists risked their lives to spread pamphlets. Underground presses kept truth alive. And then came the assassination of Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr. in 1983, a moment that cracked the facade. Aquino, a fierce critic of Marcos, had been in exile. When he dared return, he was gunned down on the airport tarmac. The message from the regime was clear: cross us and you die. But instead of silencing opposition, Aquino's murder ignited it. Millions of Filipinos saw the bullet not just as an attack on a man, but as an assault on whatever scraps of democracy they still had. The 1980s became a decade of unraveling. Economic collapse worsened. Protests grew louder. Even the US, Marcos's longtime sponsor, began to see the dictator as more liability than asset. By 1986, the stage was set for the people power revolution. And here's the irony. After 20 years of dictatorship, after torture chambers and looted billions, it wasn't a bloody civil war that toppled Marcos. It was people, ordinary Filipinos, priests, nuns, workers, students, standing shoulder to shoulder on Edsa Avenue, demanding his fall. Tanks rolled out. Soldiers pointed guns. And yet, confronted with unarmed civilians, many refused to fire. Power, built on fear, began to crumble when fear itself was broken. Ferdinand and Imelda fled to Hawaii, abandoning Malacañang Palace like rats escaping a sinking ship. And when the doors of the palace were opened, the world saw the grotesque theater of their rule laid bare. Closets overflowing with gowns, shelves stacked with designer shoes, millions in cash and jewelry scattered like the loot of a pirate king. It was the material evidence of a dynasty that had treated the Philippines not as a nation, but as a carcass to be picked clean. But here's the cruel twist. The Marcoses never truly vanished. Ferdinand died in exile in 1989, yes, but Imelda returned. And not only did she return, she ran for office. She gave interviews. She smiled for cameras. She reinvented herself not as a thief of billions, but as a tragic widow, a misunderstood queen. And the people, battered by decades of dysfunction, sometimes even bought it. Decades later, their son Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. would ride the family name back into the presidency. It was as if history itself had decided to mock the Philippines, reminding everyone that dynasties don't die. They mutate, they endure. They come back wearing new suits, rehearsing new lies. This is the story of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, a love story drenched in greed, a dynasty that mistook the Philippines for a personal estate, a reign that fused glamour with brutality, shopping sprees with torture chambers, kleptocracy with dictatorship. For 20 years, they bled a nation dry. And even when toppled, their shadow lingered, a scar carved into the memory of a people, a dynasty that proved corruption doesn't always end in exile. Sometimes it gets elected again. Marcos didn't just rule with soldiers and guns. He ruled with stories. Tall tales spun into national myths, each one designed to cement the illusion that he was indispensable. He painted himself as a war hero, a man of destiny, chosen by fate to rescue the Philippines from chaos. And while people starved in slums, those myths played on repeat in schools, on radio, in newspapers. The press, muzzled by censors, became his propaganda machine. It's amazing how silence can be louder than truth when a dictator holds the pen. Martial law gave him the power to erase entire chapters of opposition. The prisons swelled with students, journalists, priests, union leaders. Some were beaten until their bodies gave up. Others were tortured until their minds fractured. And some simply disappeared, swallowed whole by the state, leaving families with nothing but unanswered questions. For the Marcos regime, fear was efficient, cleaner than debate, faster than democracy. And yet, while the midnight raids terrified the public, they also revealed the regime's greatest weakness, the desperate need to control every whisper, every rumor, every thought. Because deep down they knew that truth was the one thing they couldn't bury forever. And then there was the kleptocracy, so outrageous it almost looked like parody. Billions of dollars disappeared into thin air, only to reappear as Manhattan skyscrapers, Swiss bank accounts, paintings from old masters. Ferdinand ran the country like a mob boss with a national treasury at his disposal. He wasn't satisfied with kickbacks or bribes. He wanted it all. Oil companies, media outlets, airlines, banks. If it turned a profit, he found a way to sink his claws into it. His cronies thrived, their fortunes ballooning as they licked the boots of power. Meanwhile, the peso collapsed, inflation skyrocketed, and average Filipinos scraped coins together just to put rice on the table. Imelda, for her part, turned corruption into performance art. She was the original influencer before Instagram existed. Always photographed, always dazzling, always spinning her life of obscene luxury into a narrative of beauty for the nation. She built cultural centers that doubled as vanity projects, monuments to her ego disguised as public service. She bought art not to preserve it, but to flaunt it, hanging stolen masterpieces on walls as if they were props in a never-ending beauty pageant. And of course, the shoes. Thousands of pairs, each one a middle finger to the millions of Filipinos too poor to afford even one good pair. To Imelda, shoes weren't just fashion. They were a crown of leather and silk, proof that she had risen above the mud of poverty and never intended to step back down. But let's not forget the geopolitical stage. Marcos wasn't operating in a vacuum. He had powerful friends, namely the United States. During the Cold War, Washington looked at the Philippines and saw a strategic gold mine, military bases, proximity to Asia, and a leader who promised to keep communism at bay. Human rights abuses, torture chambers, billions stolen. As long as Marcos kept the Reds out, America was happy to write the checks. It is one of history's most cynical bargains. Democracy sacrificed on the altar of geopolitics, with the Filipino people paying the price. When US presidents smiled beside Marcos, they weren't just shaking hands with a dictator. They were co-signing his brutality. And yet even dictators miscalculate. By the early 1980s, the cracks in the regime grew wider. The economy tanked under the weight of debt and corruption. The glitzy facade of prosperity crumbled, exposing the rot beneath. Strikes erupted, protests swelled, and whispers of rebellion grew louder. And then came the moment that turned whispers into roars, the assassination of Ninoy Aquino. One bullet on the tarmac pierced not just his skull, but the very illusion of Marcos's invincibility. The image of Aquino's body, lifeless and bleeding, became a rallying cry. People who once cowered began to stand taller. Fear, that most precious commodity of the regime, began to lose its grip. Imelda, of course, tried to spin it. She always did. She gave interviews dripping with melodrama, casting herself as the suffering wife of a maligned leader. But no amount of crocodile tears could wash away the blood on the runway. The people saw through it. Aquino's death shattered the silence. Suddenly, songs, poems, marches, and graffiti screamed what people had long been too terrified to say. The Marcos myth machine was breaking down, and no amount of propaganda could patch it back together. By 1986, the situation was untenable. Marcos, ever the gambler, called a snap election, thinking he could rig his way to another victory. But cheating has a funny way of backfiring when the whole world is watching. Reports of ballot stuffing, intimidation, and fraud spread like wildfire. The opposition, led by Corazon Aquino, Ninoy's widow, refused to back down, and the people, weary, hungry, furious, poured into the streets. What followed was the People Power Revolution, a 4-day uprising that shook the foundations of dictatorship without a single gunshot fired in anger. Tanks rolled onto Edsa Avenue, but the soldiers inside hesitated when faced with nuns holding rosaries, children offering flowers, civilians linking arms. The regime that once ruled through fear now found itself powerless against courage. And just like that, the house of cards collapsed. Marcos fled to Hawaii, dragging Imelda and crates of loot with him. Malacañang Palace was left behind as a grotesque museum of greed. Closets stuffed with gowns, safes overflowing with jewels, luxury items stacked like a warehouse of sins. The image of Imelda's shoe collection became an international punchline, but for Filipinos it was no joke. It was proof of how grotesquely out of touch the dynasty had become, how completely they had plundered a nation in pursuit of excess. But dictatorships rarely die clean deaths. Marcos himself lived out his exile in comfort, pampered in Hawaii until his death in 1989. Imelda, undeterred, plotted her return. And return she did, strutting back onto Philippine soil with the audacity of someone who had stolen billions and still believed she deserved applause. She ran for president. She gave speeches dripping with nostalgia for her so-called golden age. She posed for cameras, her smile as rehearsed as ever, as if her family's crimes were just a bad rumor. And disturbingly, some people listened. Because here's the bitter truth. Memory fades, pain dulls, and dynasties know how to reinvent themselves. Their children, their cronies, their allies, they never vanished. They waited, patiently, carefully. They watched the political winds shift. And decades later, their patience paid off. Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., the son of the dictator, reclaimed the presidency in 2022. It was the kind of plot twist that would make history teachers throw their chalk at the wall. The dynasty, once toppled, had risen again, dressed in modern rhetoric, fueled by social media propaganda and lubricated by the same old lies. The kleptocracy had mutated, but its DNA was unmistakable. So what is the legacy of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos? It's a scar, a cautionary tale of how power can corrupt absolutely, how wealth stolen from the people can build palaces, but never peace. It's the story of a nation bled dry, of thousands tortured and disappeared, of billions looted, of truth twisted into myth. But it's also a story of resilience, of people who in 1986 showed the world that dictators can be toppled not with bullets, but with unity. The tragedy is that the dynasty's shadow still lingers, reminding us that history has a nasty habit of repeating itself when lies go unchallenged. The beauty of Marcos's lies was how shameless they were. Take his so-called war heroics. He bragged about leading guerrilla units against the Japanese, collecting medals like they were Pokemon cards. The problem? Most of those medals were either self-awarded or completely fabricated. The US Army outright called his stories bogus. But did that stop him? Of course not. He plastered those tales into campaign speeches, history books, and official biographies until fiction and fact blurred into a single, shiny myth. And people, desperate for heroes after the war, believed. That's the sick genius of Marcos. He knew people didn't want truth. They wanted a story they could cling to. And Imelda? She perfected the art of weaponized glamour. She didn't just walk into a room, she colonized it. Foreign dignitaries would arrive, and Imelda would sweep in wearing gowns that looked like they'd been woven from arrogance and diamonds. She once chartered an entire airplane just to go shopping. She'd fly to New York, Rome, or Paris, buy art worth millions, then return with a smile and a line about uplifting the Filipino spirit. It was obscene, but wrapped in so much sparkle that some people mistook it for national pride. She wasn't just a first lady. She was a one-woman distraction campaign, a rhinestone curtain hiding the bloodstains underneath. Meanwhile, back in the Philippines, life for ordinary people rotted. Farmers sank deeper into poverty. Journalists vanished into military prisons. Activists woke up to fists, wires, and water torture. And all the while, Ferdinand's face smirked from billboards, currency, stamps, and television. He wasn't just running the country. He was branding it, stamping his name and image on every corner, like a dictator influencer, centuries before hashtags existed. It was a cult of personality, fed daily with fear, propaganda, and stolen cash. The military thrived under this system. Generals fattened themselves on patronage, each one tied to Marcos by chains of loyalty greased with money. Torture chambers weren't rogue operations, they were policy. Fear was a business, and the state was its CEO. Marcos even had the gall to say martial law was for the benefit of the people, as if curfews, censorship, and electric shocks to the genitals were some kind of patriotic spa treatment. But that was the Marcos method. Lie so boldly that truth sounds boring by comparison. And then came the debt. My God, the debt. Marcos borrowed billions from international lenders, promising modernization, progress, industrialization. What the Philippines got instead were white elephants, massive projects that looked good in brochures, but functioned like expensive jokes. The Bataan nuclear power plant, for example, cost over $2 billion, sat right on an earthquake fault line, and never produced a single watt of electricity. It became a monument to corruption, glowing not with power, but with the radiation of wasted potential. Every Filipino paid the bill, while the Marcoses pocketed the commissions. Of course, corruption breeds cronies, and Marcos surrounded himself with them like barnacles on a sinking ship. Businessmen who kissed the ring got monopolies, judges who played along got promotions, generals who cracked skulls got mansions, and when anyone stepped out of line, Marcos reminded them that betrayal came with consequences. Some were bankrupted, some were disgraced, some simply disappeared. Loyalty wasn't just rewarded, it was mandatory for survival. The opposition, battered but unbroken, kept resisting. Underground newspapers, whispered meetings, songs sung in secret. They fought with words when guns were suicide. But the cost was staggering. Families torn apart, children orphaned, communities silenced. Every protest carried the risk of beatings, imprisonment, or worse. And yet slowly, courage grew. Because when people have nothing left to lose, even fear loses its grip. The breaking point was Aquino's assassination. That moment wasn't just a tragedy, it was a revelation. The regime could no longer hide behind myths of order and stability. The emperor had no clothes, only a blood-stained runway. And for the first time, millions saw the dictatorship not as a shield, but as the blade pressed against their throats. Marcos, in his paranoia, had created his own downfall. But don't think for a second that the fall erased the damage. Even as the people power revolution toppled him, the Philippines was left in ruins. Billions missing, institutions hollowed out, corruption baked so deeply into the system that removing it was like trying to scrub poison from bone marrow. The Marcos dynasty didn't just rob the nation of wealth, they robbed it of decades of progress, of trust in governance, of faith that leaders could ever truly serve the people. And Imelda, dear Imelda, turned infamy into theater. After fleeing to Hawaii, she lived in luxury while ordinary Filipinos scraped to survive the debts her husband had saddled them with. When she finally returned, she strutted like a queen returning from vacation rather than exile. She gave interviews in which she dismissed accusations as slander, claiming that history would vindicate her. She smiled as if billions hadn't vanished, as if thousands hadn't been tortured. It was gaslighting on a national scale. And the most disturbing part? Some people believed her, because time erases scars, and nostalgia is a hell of a drug. Their son Bong Bong perfected this playbook. He didn't run from the family name. He embraced it, polished it, rebranded it. He used social media to rewrite history, painting the martial law years as a golden age of order and prosperity. TikToks, YouTube videos, Facebook posts, all humming with the same false tune. Life was better under Marcos. It was propaganda 2.0, slick, viral, targeted at a generation too young to remember the terror firsthand. And it worked. In 2022, Bong Bong rode that wave straight into Malacanang Palace, proving that dynasties don't just survive scandals, they survive revolutions. So here we are, decades later, staring at the grotesque legacy of Ferdinand and Imelda. They showed the world how to steal billions, crush dissent, and still stage a comeback. They proved that glamour can mask brutality, that myths can outlive facts, and that power, once entrenched, never really dies. It simply waits, shapeshifts, and knocks on the door again, wearing a new smile. The Marcoses didn't just scar the Philippines, they taught it and the world in the most cynical lesson of all. Sometimes history doesn't punish tyrants. Sometimes it re-elects them. The Marcos Empire was never just about money. It was about performance. Every move was theater. Ferdinand wasn't satisfied with being a thief. He wanted to be remembered as a statesman, a visionary, a savior. Imelda wasn't content with being rich. She wanted to be eternal, a goddess draped in sequins and silk. That is why their rule feels so surreal when you look back. Because it wasn't just corruption, it was corruption dressed as art. Every banquet, every ribbon cutting, every foreign trip was a scene in their self-directed play, with the Filipino people cast as unwilling extras footing the bill. And like all plays, theirs had acts. The rise Ferdinand, the boy genius who charmed his way into politics, and Imelda, the beauty queen who became his crown. The corruption, 20 years of martial law, where a nation was smothered under velvet gloves hiding iron fists. The fall, the people power revolution. A finale that should have ended the performance for good. But this wasn't Shakespeare, this was history. And history has a sick sense of humor. The legacy of martial law isn't just the bodies in shallow graves, or the torture scars, or the missing billions. It's the normalization of theft, the corrosion of truth. The idea that politics isn't about service but survival. Not for the people but for the dynasty. Every peso stolen, every activist silenced, every false history book printed was a nail in the coffin of trust. And yet somehow, decades later, the coffin cracked open and out stepped Bongbong Marcos, smiling as if nothing had happened. That's the real horror story. Not that a dictator rose, not that he fell, but that his bloodline rose again, grinning, ready for a sequel. Because dynasties don't think in terms of elections, they think in terms of centuries. Ferdinand may have died in Hawaii, but Imelda outlived him, still fluttering her lashes for cameras, still insisting that her life of diamonds and castles was really just public service in disguise. She once claimed she had to buy art because she was custodian of culture. This from a woman who treated the national treasury like a personal piggy bank. You almost have to admire the audacity. Almost. If it weren't so disgusting. And what about the people? The millions who marched on EDSA, who faced down tanks, who toppled a dictator without firing a shot. Their victory was real, it mattered, it inspired the world. But victories, like memories, fade. Children grow up hearing stories but not feeling fear, and when fear is gone, lies creep back in. By the time Bongbong launched his campaign, the wounds of martial law had scabbed over, leaving just enough space for revisionist history to take root. The dynasty played the long game, and it worked. So what do we make of Ferdinand and Imelda now? They were thieves on a scale so massive that their crimes are hard to measure. Billions gone, generations set back, thousands of lives shattered, and yet they lived like royalty, posed for magazines, shook hands with presidents. They died not in disgrace but in comfort, their children free to reclaim power. If you're waiting for karma, don't hold your breath, because sometimes karma misses the bus. Sometimes the villains write their own epilogues and history shrugs. But don't mistake cynicism for hopelessness. The people power revolution proved something vital, that even the most entrenched dynasty can be toppled when people refuse to bow. That dictatorships, no matter how gilded, are brittle when faced with solidarity. That truth, even buried under lies, claws its way back into the light when people demand it. That's the legacy worth clinging to. Not the shoes, not the stolen billions, not the grotesque palaces of corruption, but the reminder that power only holds when people surrender it. The Marcos saga isn't just Filipino history. It's a warning for the world. Beware the charismatic liar who wraps tyranny in patriotism. Beware the glamorous distraction who masks theft with beauty. Beware the dynasty that insists it was destiny. Because once they're in, they don't just steal your money. They steal your memory. They rewrite your story until you forget it was ever yours. And when you forget, they come back, stronger, hungrier, smiling. So yes, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos scarred the Philippines. They bled it, robbed it, mocked it, and left it staggering. But scars are proof of survival. Proof that the wound didn't kill you. Proof that you're still here telling the story. And telling the story matters. because silence is the soil where dynasties grow back. Maybe history doesn't punish tyrants. Maybe sometimes it re-elects them. But history also remembers, and it laughs last. Because no matter how many gowns you buy, no matter how many shoes you line up, no matter how many billions you stash in Swiss vaults, the truth waits, patient, sharp, unforgiving. And when it resurfaces, it's uglier than any pair of gold heels Imelda ever wore. And in the end, the Marcos dynasty leaves us with one final irony. They thought they were building a golden age, a legacy of power, wealth, and beauty. But what they really built was a cautionary tale, a grotesque reminder etched into history. They may have escaped the firing squad, they may have escaped prison, they may have even clawed their way back into office. But they will never escape this. When people hear their name, they don't think heroes. They think thieves, they think dictators, they think dynasty of blood and lies. And that's a legacy no amount of diamonds can polish away.